The scent of burnt powder clung to the Parisian air, a perfume of my own making. They called it the whiff of grapeshot, a quaint term for the surgical application of cannon fire on a mob. The Royalists who had threatened the Directory were now little more than stains on the cobblestones near the Church of Saint-Roch. In the aftermath, the politicians, those men of words and trembling hands, swarmed around me. Barras, with his sly, calculating eyes, clapped me on the shoulder, calling me the saviour of the Republic. I let him. I smiled a thin, tight smile that did not reach my eyes. I knew what they saw, a useful tool, a blunt instrument with a keen edge. They did not yet see the hand that wielded it. I was 26 years old. I had tasted power, not the inherited powdered wig power of the old monarchs, nor the shrieking hysterical power of Robespierre, but something purer. It was the power of a solved equation, the cold, irrefutable logic of placing a cannon here, a line of infantry there, and achieving a desired result. Paris was a chessboard, and I had swept my opponent's pieces from the board. For this, they made me a major general, and then commander of the Army of the Interior. It was a title, a desk job. It was a cage. My days became a blur of paperwork and political maneuvering in the salons of the new elite. It was there I met her. Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow of the Terror, a survivor, with eyes that held both the memory of tragedy and a languid Creole grace that captivated the city's new masters. She was older, sophisticated, and possessed a name that opened doors mine could not. Our affair was a whirlwind, a strategic campaign of its own. I pursued her with the same single-minded intensity I brought to a battlefield. Marriage to her was a step up, an anchoring in the shifting sands of Parisian society. She was a prize of a different sort, and I claimed her in the spring of 1796. 2 days after our wedding, I left Paris. The Directory, eager to have their turbulent general at a safe distance, had given me what I craved. Not a desk, not a title, but an army. It was, however, a poisoned gift. They gave me command of the Army of Italy. The name itself was a grand joke. Upon my arrival in Nice, I found less an army and more a collection of beggars and bandits masquerading in tattered blue uniforms. 30,000 men, they told me. 30,000 starving, mutinous, shoeless men who hadn't been paid in months. Their generals, grizzled veterans like Augereau and Massena, eyed me with open suspicion. This boy from Corsica, this General Vendemiaire, promoted for shooting civilians in a city street? They saw a Parisian popinjay, reeking of political connections and Josephine's perfume. I let them stare. I walked through the camp, my slight frame rigid, my gaze sweeping over everything, my mind a whirlwind of calculation. I saw the filth, the despair, the broken carts, the skeletal horses, but I also saw the glint of hard steel in the men's eyes. They were not soft. They were hungry. And a hungry man can be made to do anything if you promise him a feast. That evening I assembled the officers. They stood before me, a gallery of insolent skepticism. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead or cajole. I spoke to them as if their victory was an established fact, a mere matter of execution. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice flat and cold, "you are in command of the most wretched army in the Republic, but you are veterans. You have the courage. You lack only the will." I paused, letting my eyes drift from one defiant face to the next. "The government has forgotten you, but I am here. Look across those mountains." I gestured eastward, towards the formidable barrier of the Alps. Beyond them lie the plains of Lombardy. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. Soldiers, my voice rose then, sharp and cutting like a bayonet. You are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much. It can give you nothing. Your patience, the courage you show in the midst of these rocks are admirable, but they bring you no glory. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, fame, and wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage or perseverance? A silence fell. It was as if the air itself had solidified. I had not offered them patriotic platitudes about liberty. I had offered them a transaction, their courage in exchange for the wealth of Italy. I saw the flicker of understanding, then greed, then a grudging respect in their eyes. The transaction was accepted. Within weeks, we moved. We did not march. We fell upon the enemy like a hawk from a cliff. The Austrians and their Piedmontese allies were comfortable, commanded by old men, who understood the stately, predictable dance of 18th-century warfare. They expected me to besiege fortresses. I bypassed them. They expected me to fight on established fronts. I sent divisions slicing through mountain passes they considered impassable, appearing where I was least expected. I hit them at Montenotte, then Millesimo, then Dego. I kept their forces separated, defeating each in turn with the full weight of my own. My strategy was simple: speed, concentration of force, and utter, unrelenting audacity. The old generals looked at their maps and could not comprehend what was happening. We were a torrent, and they were stones in the riverbed. The campaign culminated at the bridge of Lodi over the river Adda. Taking the town was strategically important, but the bridge was something else. It was a long, narrow wooden structure, 300 feet of a killing ground, defended by the cannons of the Austrian rear guard. My generals told me it was madness to attempt a frontal assault. A flanking maneuver would be safer, they counseled. I stood on the river bank, telescope pressed to my eye, watching the Austrian gunners preparing their canister shot. Safety. The word was an obscenity. Safety did not win wars. Safety did not forge empires. Terror did. The spectacle of impossible courage, that is what shatters an enemy's soul. This is not a time for caution, I declared. The Austrians must be made to feel that we are not merely better soldiers, but a different kind of soldier. One that does not know fear. I set up our own cannons, and for a moment I worked one myself, sighting it, feeling the familiar, reassuring recoil. The men saw this, the commander-in-chief, aiming a gun like a common artilleryman. A murmur ran through the ranks. I gave the order. The column of grenadiers formed, an impossibly dense spearhead of men. At their head were Massena, Berthier, Lannes, my fiercest marshals. The drums began to roll, a frantic, thundering heartbeat. Forward! They ran into hell. The bridge erupted in smoke and splinters. The Austrian cannons fired, and the front rank of the column simply dissolved, swept away by a storm of metal. The men faltered, the charge slowing under the sheer weight of death. They sought cover behind the wooden pillars of the bridge. The attack was about to fail. In that moment, something shifted within me. It was no longer a calculation. It was pure, unadulterated will. I spurred my horse forward, shouting, waving them on. My generals were already on the bridge, swords in hand, screaming encouragement. The men saw them, their leaders sharing the ultimate risk, and a roar went up from 1,000 throats. It was the sound of a force of nature being unleashed. They surged forward again, a blue wave of fury, pouring over the bridge, trampling their own dead and wounded. They stormed the Austrian guns, bayoneting the gunners where they stood. The Austrian line broke. They fled. Lodi was ours. That night, as I walked through the camp, the soldiers did not just salute me. They cheered, and I heard it for the first time, a nickname born from the smoke and fire. Of the bridge, a term of rough, soldierly affection, le petit caporal, the little corporal. They gave it to me because I had not directed the battle from a safe distance. I had sighted a cannon myself, stood with them under fire. In their eyes, I had earned my stripes anew, not from the politicians in Paris, but from the canister shot of the enemy. Lying in my tent that night, sleep was impossible. The fire of Lodi still burned behind my eyes. It was more than a victory. It was a revelation. A current of destiny, hot and undeniable, coursed through my veins. Before this day I had seen myself as merely a superior general. But on that bloody bridge, watching men die and live at my command, feeling the hinge of history turn, on my will I knew with a certainty that was as absolute as a law of physics that I was different. I was not a man who served events. I was a man who created them. The thought arrived, fully formed and brilliant, that I might indeed play a decisive part on our political stage. The vague ambition of my youth had finally found its form. The world was not a chessboard to be mastered. It was clay to be moulded, and I, Napoleon Bonaparte, was the sculptor. The sculptor needed a new studio and a grander subject. Italy had been a fine block of marble, but I had carved from it all that I could. The Treaty of Campo Formio was my signature chiseled at its base. I returned to Paris not as a general, but as a phenomenon. The city, hungry for heroes after the bloodletting of the Terror, devoured me. My name was on every lip, my portrait in every shop window. The directors, those 5 overstuffed chairs pretending to be a government, welcomed me with speeches as hollow as their promises. I saw the envy in Barras's eyes, the fear in the others. They praised me in public while plotting my obsolescence in private. They saw a sword, sharp and useful, but a sword that must be sheathed, lest it cut the hand that holds it. Their offer was England, an invasion, across the Channel, a glorious, impossible task designed to consume me and my army in the unforgiving waters ruled by the British Navy. It was a gilded coffin. I saw their game at once. They feared my popularity, my connection to the army. The men who called me Le Petit Caporal. They wanted to send me to my doom, to be celebrated as a tragic martyr for France. I would not be their Iphigenia. In the dim light of my study on Rue Chantereine, surrounded by maps and histories, a different vision took hold. A grander vision. Why strike the limb when one could strike the heart of their commerce? Why wrestle with their navy in the cold mists of the north when we could seize the ancient trade routes under a southern sun? The idea came to me as Lodi had, a bolt of lightning that illuminated the entire landscape. Egypt, the land of pharaohs and Ptolemies, the gateway to India. Alexander had marched east. Caesar had been captivated by its queen. History itself beckoned. I presented my plan to the Directory. They were baffled, then intrigued. The idea was so audacious, so far from their narrow European schemes that they couldn't fully grasp it. But they grasped one thing perfectly. It would take me, Napoleon Bonaparte, far, far away from Paris. They saw it as a grand exile. I saw it as the forging of an empire. They gave me their blessing, eager to be rid of the troublesome hero. Fools! They thought they were pointing me to the edge of the world. I knew I was marching toward its center. The Mediterranean crossing was a triumph of will. We evaded Nelson's fleet, seized Malta as an afterthought, and landed on the shores of Egypt. The heat was a physical blow, the sand an ocean of fire. My soldiers, sons of Normandy and Gascony, grumbled under the alien sun. But I gave them a new creed, standing before the men, with the timeless pyramids shimmering in the haze. I gave them their purpose. Soldiers, I declared, my voice cutting through the dry air. From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries looked down upon you, and they fought like men possessed. The Mamluk cavalry, fearsome and splendid, broke against our disciplined squares at the Battle of the Pyramids. We were masters of Cairo. For a moment, the vision was real. I was a new lawgiver in the oldest of lands. I established councils, respected local customs, and brought my savants, the scientists and artists, I had brought with me to catalogue, measure, and understand this cradle of civilization. I was not merely a conqueror, I was the bearer of the Enlightenment. The clay was soft. Then came the news that shattered the dream. Nelson, he had found our fleet, anchored in Aboukir Bay. My admiral, the brave but foolish Bruys, had believed himself safe. Nelson descended like a hawk, and in a single night of fire and thunder, my connection to France was severed. My fleet was a collection of burning splinters at the bottom of the Nile. We were stranded. The sculptor was trapped in his studio, the doors barred from the outside. A lesser man would have despaired, but despair is a luxury destiny cannot afford. The news hit me like a physical blow, a void opening in my chest. For a day I retreated into myself, the silence of my Cairo headquarters more deafening than any cannonade. Then the will reasserted itself. If we could not be supplied from the sea, we would live off the land. If we could not return to France, we would build a new France here. If the Ottoman Empire, stirred by the British, meant to challenge me, I would take the war to them. The Syrian campaign was born of this grim necessity. It was not like Italy. There were no cheering crowds, no rich cities ripe for plunder. There was only sand, thirst, and plague. We marched north into Palestine, my soldiers falling not just to Turkish muskets, but to the invisible enemy that turned their bodies black and their spirits to ash. In Jaffa, I walked through the plague hospital, touching the sores of the sick to quell the rising panic. A general must be more than a strategist, he must be a symbol, an inoculation against fear itself. And then Acre, a miserable, crumbling port town, defended by a motley garrison of Turks, and an infuriatingly resourceful British naval officer, Sidney Smith. He used his ship's cannons as mobile artillery. He armed the populace. He fought, with a theatrical tenacity that mocked my scientific principles of siegecraft. For 2 months, we threw ourselves against those ancient walls. My engineers mined, my cannons roared, my grenadiers charged into the breach time and again, only to be thrown back. The sand drank their blood. It was there, in the dust and frustration before Acre, that I felt the first true check on my destiny. The hinge of history, which I had felt turn so easily at Lodi, was rusted shut. My will, which I believed could bend reality, shattered against those stones. Sidney Smith, a man I considered little more than a flamboyant pirate, was thwarting me. Me? It was an intimate, personal humiliation. The world was not clay after all. It was also granite. One evening, after another failed assault, I received a packet of newspapers from a smuggler. They were months old, but they told a story of utter disaster. Scherer defeated in Italy, Jourdan routed in Germany. The fruits of my Italian campaign all squandered. The Directory was despised. France was in turmoil, threatened with invasion. And I was here, bogged down before a pile of rocks, my grand Eastern dream dead. The revelation was the inverse of Lodi. Then I had discovered myself. Now I discovered my true stage. My destiny was not to be a new Alexander in Asia. My destiny was France. She was sick, rudderless, crying out for a firm hand. The fools in Paris had let my masterpiece crumble. The sculptor was needed back home, not to carve a new statue, but to repair and remold the nation itself. The decision was cold, swift, and absolute. To abandon my army was a terrible thing. They were my men, my children who had followed me into this furnace. But what was one army compared to the fate of France? A surgeon does not hesitate to amputate a limb to save the body. I made my arrangements in secret. I would leave Kleber in command, a capable man. I wrote my proclamations, shifting the blame, promising a glorious return. On a dark night in August 1799, with a few chosen followers, I slipped onto a small frigate, the Muron, and set sail for home. As the shores of Egypt faded into the night, I felt no guilt, only a burning, furious purpose. I had tasted victory and defeat, glory and humiliation. I had learned the limits of my power against stubborn walls and the vastness of the sea. But I had also learned that my true power lay not in conquering foreign lands, but in mastering the soul of my own. The East was a dream, a fever that had broken. France was the reality. The clay was waiting, and this time I would not just mould it. I would fire it in a kiln of my own making until it was as hard and brilliant as my will. The voyage was a trial by nerve. For 47 days the Mediterranean was a chessboard, and the British fleet under Nelson was the opposing queen. We hugged the African coast, a ghost ship slipping through the dark, guided by stars and sheer audacity. Every sail on the horizon was a potential end, every dawn a reprieve. My companions, Lannes, Murat, Berthier, saw it as a gamble. I saw it as the first filter of destiny. If I was meant to fail, the sea would have me. But she did not. The winds of fortune, it seemed, blew for France. When we landed at Fréjus, I expected a cautious reception, perhaps even arrest. I was, after all, a general who had abandoned his post. Instead, France fell into my arms. The news of my arrival spread like wildfire, carried on the wind itself. People poured from the towns and villages, their faces etched with a desperate hope. They did not shout for a general, they shouted for a savior. Vive Bonaparte! They cried, Vive la République! But in their eyes, the two had become one and the same. They did not see the man who had failed to take Acre. They saw the hero of Italy, the conqueror of Egypt. They saw the legend I had so carefully crafted, and their belief gave it a substance more real than any fortress wall. The journey to Paris was a triumphal procession through a nation on its knees. Paris was a gilded sty. The Directory, a committee of 5 kings, had all the pomp of a monarchy with none of its stability. Barras, that corrupt survivor, still presided over his decadent court, a spider grown fat in the center of a fraying web. Size, the high priest of the revolution, spun endless constitutional theories, intricate clocks with no hands to tell the time. The government was bankrupt, the highways were ruled by bandits, and the political factions snarled at each other like starving dogs over a bone. They spoke of liberty while the nation starved for bread and order. My masterpiece was not just crumbling, it was being devoured by vermin. I established myself in my modest house on the Rue de la Victoire, but it quickly became the true center of power in Paris. Talleyrand, that limping serpent of diplomacy, was among the first to call, his every word a veiled proposition. Fouché, the chief of police, offered me his network of spies, his loyalty for sale to the highest bidder. And then came Size himself. He was a tall, thin man, cold as a January morning, an architect of ideas who lacked the hands of a builder. He had a plan for a coup, a design for a new government. What he needed was a sword. "The state is collapsing, General," he said, his voice dry as parchment. "The Jacobins plot in the shadows, the Royalists in the open. The Directory is powerless. We need a change, a fundamental revision of the Constitution." "A constitution is merely words on paper, Abbé," I replied, studying him. He was useful, essential even, but he thought the battle was one of ideas. It is the will behind the words that gives them force. What you need is not a revision, but a foundation. And you, I take it, are that foundation? He asked, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. "I am the granite upon which a lasting structure can be built," I said, my voice level. "You have the plans, I have the masons, and the bayonets to guard them. We formed our pact, an alliance of the thinker and the doer. My brother, Lucien, then president of the Council of 500, was our voice within the system we intended to destroy. The plan was simple in its audacity: feign a Jacobin plot, persuade the two. Legislative councils to relocate to the safety of the Château de Saint-Cloud outside Paris, and there, surrounded by loyal troops, compel them. To dissolve the Directory, and appoint a new provisional government. A coup cloaked in the robes of legality. The morning of the 18th Brumaire, November 9th by the new calendar, began in a cold drizzle. Paris was tense, the air thick with rumor. I addressed the Council of Ancients first, my words clumsy and blunt. I was a soldier, not a politician. I spoke of saving the Republic, of conspiracies and dangers. They were old men, cautious and easily frightened. They voted to approve the move to Saint-Cloud. The first step was taken. Barras, seeing the tide turn, resigned in ignominy. The Directory was broken. The next day, at Saint-Cloud, the true battle began. The atmosphere in the palace was venomous. The Council of 500, meeting in the Grand Orangery, was a nest of Jacobin fervor. They knew a coup was in motion. When I entered their chamber, flanked by 4 grenadiers, the room erupted. "Down with the dictator! Outlaw him! Hors la loi!" The cries rained down on me. It was a storm of words, but for a moment it felt more threatening than Austrian canister shot. These were not soldiers to be commanded, but a mob to be persuaded, and rhetoric was a weapon I had not yet mastered. Deputies in their red togas surged forward, shaking their fists in my face, grabbing at my collar. For a dizzying second, the scene threatened to overwhelm me. I, who had faced down Mamluk cavalry, was being suffocated by angry lawyers. My aides dragged me out, my face scratched, my uniform torn. I was shaken, not by fear, but by a cold, searing rage. The sheer ingratitude. The blindness. This was my moment of truth. Not a test of courage, but of will. As I staggered outside into the courtyard, gasping for air, the entire enterprise hung by a thread. But then Providence, in the form of my brother, intervened. Lucien, in his presidential robes, rushed out onto a balcony overlooking the troops guarding the palace. His voice, clear and powerful, cut through the confusion. He pointed back towards the chamber, then at me. "That man," he thundered, "your general, came to speak to your representatives, and he was met with daggers. They are assassins in the pay of England. I swear," he cried, drawing his own sword and pointing it at my heart, "to plunge this blade into my own brother's breast if he ever attempts to destroy the liberty of the French." It was magnificent theatre. It was the lie that saved the truth. The soldiers, who had been hesitant, were now incensed. Murat, my fiery cavalryman, needed no further bidding. He gave the order. A drum roll began, a sound I knew better than my own name. It was the sound of decision. Forward! The grenadiers fixed bayonets and marched into the orangery. There was no battle, only a panicked scramble. The great legislators of France, who moments before had been bellowing for my head, tumbled over each other to escape. They fled through the doors, clambered out of the tall windows. There, red togas flapping in the winter wind as they vanished into the woods. The room was empty in minutes, littered with abandoned cloaks and scattered papers. The law had been scattered by the sword. That night a rump of the council was gathered to give our coup the veneer of legality. They formally abolished the Directory and appointed 3 consuls to lead a new government, CIs, a placeholder named Ducos, and myself. As we stood in the dimly lit hall, Sees turned to me. "Well, General," he said, a touch of irony in his voice, "we have a new government." I looked at him, then at the scattered remnants of the old. They had tried to fight me with words and procedures. They failed to understand that power is not a debate. It is a reality. It is the ability to act, to build, to command. They had offered France chaos and called it liberty. I would offer them order, glory, and unity. I would give them a nation forged in my own image. "You have a government, Abbe," I corrected him, my voice quiet but absolute. "I have France." The clay was no longer waiting. It was in my hands. The kiln was lit. Sea Eyes offered no reply, merely a thin, bloodless smile that did not reach his eyes. He was a creature of parchment and ink, a weaver of constitutions. He thought he had designed a finely balanced clockwork, but he had failed to account for the mainspring. I left them to their legal fictions and returned to my house on the Rue de la Victoire, to Josephine. She was waiting, of course, her face a perfect mask of anxious beauty under the soft lamplight of her salon. The scent of roses and her own unique perfume filled the air, a stark contrast to the stale odor of fear and ambition that still clung to my greatcoat. She rose as I entered, her hands clasped, her dark eyes searching mine for the outcome of the day's gamble. "It is done," I said, allowing myself a weary smile. "France has a new dawn." She did not ask about the details of the power I had seized, only about the risks. That was Josephine. She understood the world not through ideology or political mechanics, but through people, through loyalties and passions. She was the one who had softened my rough edges, who had taught the Corsican, artilleryman, how to navigate the treacherous currents of Parisian society. She was my talisman, my étoile, my star of destiny. In those early days I believed I could not succeed without her. Her children, Eugene and Hortense, were there as well. Eugene, a fine, steady young man, already a good soldier. Hortense, a girl of quiet grace. I looked at them, her children from a dead viscount, and felt a pang of something I refused to name. They were part of her, and therefore part of my household, my nascent court. I would make Eugene a viceroy, and marry Hortense to my brother, grafting them onto my own family tree. But they were not my blood. The thought was a whisper then, easily dismissed amidst the clamour of state-building. France was my child, the grand army my progeny. That was enough. The years that followed were a whirlwind of fire and creation. I gave France the code, a foundation of law so solid it would outlast all my victories. I gave her banks, roads, and lycees. I crowned myself emperor in Notre Dame, with Josephine at my side, her grace making the manufactured ceremony feel almost sacred. For a decade, my will was the engine of Europe. I redrew the map with my sword, made and unmade kings with a stroke of my pen. At Austerlitz, I had my son, at Jena, my masterpiece. Glory followed glory, and the empire swelled, a magnificent edifice built on conquest and genius. But within the gilded walls of the Tuileries, a silence ached. A nursery remained empty. The grandest throne in the world had no certain heir. The problem, once a whisper, became a constant throbbing drumbeat. My brothers, whom I had placed on thrones they did not deserve, plotted for the succession. My ministers spoke in hushed, urgent tones about stability, about continuity. An empire built by one man, no matter how great, would crumble upon his death. It needed a dynasty. It needed a son. Josephine felt the chill long before I spoke the words. I would see it in her eyes as she watched children playing in the gardens. She filled the palace with flowers, as if their rampant fertility could somehow infect its mistress. She consulted physicians, charlatans, and mystics. Her desperation was a mirror to my own cold political necessity. The love between us had not died, but it had been wounded by this shared failure. It was a love born of ambition and passion, a partnership. But the ultimate purpose of an empress was to provide an heir, and in this, my star had failed me. I still desired her, still found solace in her company, but when I looked at her, I no longer saw just the woman I loved, I saw the dead end of my bloodline. The decision, when it came, was the most brutal act of my life, more difficult than ordering any cavalry charge into the teeth of cannon fire. The scene remains etched in my memory. A cold evening in the winter of 1809. I told her in my study, the fire crackling, casting dancing shadows on the wall that made our faces seem like tragic masks. "Josephine," I began, my voice hoarse, "the interests of France and my dynasty require, they demand what our hearts reject." She understood, immediately. A single, choked sob escaped her before she composed herself with that incredible dignity she possessed. Her tears were silent, but they were more devastating than any cannonade. She knew it was not a matter of affection, but of statecraft. I was sacrificing my own heart on the altar of the state I had created. At the public ceremony of the annulment, she read her statement of devotion, her voice trembling but unbroken. I stood like a statue of granite, feeling nothing and everything all at once. I was the emperor, and the emperor must be relentless, even with himself. The search for a new wife was a cold, calculated affair. A Russian Grand Duchess was considered, but it was the oldest house in Europe that truly tempted me, the Habsburgs. To marry the daughter of the Austrian emperor, the niece of the executed Marie Antoinette, was the ultimate statement. It was to graft my revolutionary meritocratic dynasty onto the ancient rootstock of European royalty. It would legitimize me. It would give my heir the bluest of blood. Marie-Louise was a child, barely 18, pale and timid. She was not Josephine. She possessed none of her style, her wit, her passionate fire. She was brought to me like a tribute, a pretty, pliable vessel for the imperial seed. Our wedding was an affair of state, magnificent and hollow. I was polite, attentive even. I did my duty as a husband and she hers as a wife. There was no grand passion, only the quiet mutual understanding of our dynastic purpose, and she fulfilled it. On the morning of March 20th, 1811, all of Paris held its breath. The cannons of Les Invalides were to fire the salute. 21 shots for a girl, 101 for a boy. I paced my study, the architect of Europe reduced to a nervous, expectant father. The first shot boomed, and I began to count. 10, 15, 20. A dreadful pause hung over the city, and then the 22nd shot thundered through the air, and the city erupted in a joyous roar that washed over the palace in waves. I rushed to the birthing chamber. They brought him to me, a small red-faced creature wrapped in the finest lace. Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles Bonaparte, the King of Rome. I took the small, swaddled form into my arms. He was so fragile, so utterly dependent, and yet, in my hands, I felt the weight of an eternity. This was not a treaty signed or a battle won. This was life. This was my blood, my name, my future made flesh. I looked down at his sleeping face, at the faint dusting of fair hair, and felt a surge of possessive, absolute love that dwarfed even my ambition. My critics saw this child as the ultimate symbol of my arrogance. But they were wrong. He was the symbol of my permanence. The laws, the victories, the Arc de Triomphe, they were all stone and paper. But this was the living continuation of my will. The clay I had seized that night in 1799 was no longer just the nation of France. It was now my own lineage, shaped and fired in the same kiln of my ambition. I had a son. My empire had an heir. I had chained fate to my will and forged a second immortal self. Nothing, I was certain, could ever break it. The early years were a golden haze, a symphony of my own composition. I would have Francois, my little L'Aiglon, the eaglet, brought to my study, amidst the maps of a conquered Europe, the blueprints for grand Parisian monuments, and the endless stream of dispatches. He was the living, breathing centerpiece. I would spread toy soldiers across the floor, brightly painted regiments of tin and lead, and watch his small hands marshal them. He would knock over the Austrian grenadiers with a clumsy sweep, babbling, with delight, and I would laugh, a sound that surprised even myself. In his innocent games, I saw a reflection of my own great work. See, I would say to Marshal Duroc, who watched from the doorway with a paternal smile. He has the instinct. He knows who must fall. Marie-Louise, his mother, would fret. She was a daughter of the Habsburgs, bred for propriety and quiet courts, not for the whirlwind of my ambition. She saw only a child playing. I saw a dynasty taking root. I would take him from her perfumed rooms and hold him up to the window, pointing to the Tuileries gardens below. All of this, Francois, I would whisper into his soft hair, and everything, the sun touches from here to the Vistula, is your birthright. I am building it for you, stone by stone, victory by victory. He would merely gurgle, his gaze fixed on a passing butterfly, but I felt he understood. How could he not? He was my blood. My will flowed through his veins. The empire, like my son, was growing. It was a sprawling, magnificent, and demanding thing. Every day brought new challenges, new threads to weave into the grand tapestry. The Spanish ulcer continued to bleed us a savage, unending war of priests and peasants that my marshals could not seem to cauterize. In the ports, my continental system, the great economic garrote I had placed around England's throat, was chafing my allies. There were murmurs from Prussia, whispers from Austria, and a worrying silence from the Tsar. Alexander, he had been my admirer, my brother monarch at Tilsit, but now he pulled at the leash, his pride stung, his merchants ruined. He was opening his ports to the English in secret, a betrayal that was both, a personal insult and a dagger pointed at the heart of my grand design. I remember one evening, the weight of it all pressing down. I was staring at a map of Russia, a vast empty canvas of white and green that seemed to absorb the candlelight of my study. Francois, now a toddler of almost 2, was on my knee. He reached out with a chubby finger and tapped the spot marked Moscow. "Papa," he said, one of the few words he knew. A chill, profound and unsettling, ran through me. It was as if fate itself was speaking through the mouth of my child. I looked from his innocent face to the sprawling map. To allow Alexander this defiance was to show weakness. To show weakness was to invite the jackals to tear at the flanks of the empire. My eagles had flown over Vienna, Berlin, Madrid, and Rome. They would fly over Moscow. It was necessary. It was destiny. I would crush this final resistance, and then there would be peace, a true Roman peace, dictated from Paris, guaranteed by the Grande Armée, and inherited by the boy in my arms. Yes, Francois, I said, my voice harder than I intended. Papa will go to Moscow, and the Tsar will learn his lesson. The world had never seen such an army. Over 500,000 men, drawn from 20 nations, a river of steel and humanity flooding eastward. I left Paris in the spring of 1812, kissing my son goodbye. He cried, clinging to my uniform, and for a moment a terrible pang of regret struck me. I was leaving this perfect, warm world of family and certainty for the harsh plains of the East. But ambition is a relentless master. The destiny of Europe, his destiny, was at stake. I hardened my heart and rode out to join my legions. The dispatches that reached me on the slow, grinding retreat from Moscow were not written in ink, but in frost and blood. They spoke of a cold so absolute it froze the very soul. They spoke of starvation, of Cossack raids, of men falling by the thousand, their frozen bodies left as signposts in the snow. General Winter, they called it. A foe I could not outwit, a flank I could not turn. I, who had bent kings and popes to my will, who had redrawn the map of a continent, was being defeated by the weather. I raced back to Paris ahead of the remnants of my army, a phantom emperor fleeing a nightmare of my own making. The city was grim. Whispers of a coup had circulated in my absence. My enemies, so long cowed, were stirring. Prussia defected. Austria, my own father-in-law's empire, began to mobilize against me. The great structure I had built was groaning, the foundations cracking under the strain of a single catastrophic miscalculation. I threw myself into the work of recovery with a fury born of desperation. I raised a new army, conscripting boys who were not much older than my son would be in a decade. But the magic was gone. The aura of invincibility that had been my greatest weapon was shattered on the road from Moscow. Europe rose against me, a coalition of all the old monarchies I had humiliated, funded by the inexhaustible gold of England. Leipzig was the death knell, the battle of the nations, where my new army of children was overwhelmed and bled white. The end came with the chilling speed of an avalanche. The Allies crossed the Rhine. France itself was invaded. I fought a brilliant, desperate campaign on our own soil, but I was leading ghosts against armies. My marshals, men who had grown rich and titled in my service, began to speak of abdication. Their nerve was broken. Betrayal, the constant companion of the falling, was everywhere. Talleyrand, that venomous serpent, was already negotiating the return of the Bourbons. They forced my hand at Fontainebleau. I sat in the same study where I had once bounced my son on my knee and looked at maps of a world I owned. Now, the map was of a single shrinking country. I signed the abdication. Emperor of Elba, they called it. A cruel joke. An island kingdom for the man who had ruled a continent. Before I left, they brought him to me one last time. Francois was 3 years old. He did not understand. He saw the grim faces, the packed carriages, his mother weeping. He was dressed in a small formal suit, no longer the babbling infant in lace, but a miniature prince, already being prepared for a life I could no longer give him. I knelt and took him in my arms. He felt so small, so terrifyingly fragile. The weight of eternity I had felt at his birth had been replaced by the crushing weight of failure. My second immortal self. My living continuation. What would become of him now? He would be raised in the Viennese court, a curiosity, the son of the ogre, taught to forget his father's name and his own birthright. They would strip him of his titles, his history, his very identity, until nothing of Napoleon remained. He looked at me with my own dark eyes, full of a child's confusion. "Are you not coming, Papa?" I could not speak. The words caught in my throat, a knot of grief and rage. I had chained a dynasty to my star, and my star had fallen from the heavens. All the victories, the laws, the glory, it had all led to this single heartbreaking moment. I was not losing an empire. I was losing my son. I was losing the future. I kissed his forehead, a desperate final act of possession. "Be a good boy, Francois," I managed to choke out. I stood up and turned away, unable to watch them lead him from the room. The door closed, and with it, the sound of my son's footsteps faded away. The chain I had forged with fate had not just broken, It had coiled back and strangled the heart of everything I had ever loved. The silence that followed was more profound than the roar of any cannonade. It was a vacuum, pulling the very air from my lungs and the strength from my bones. I stood frozen in the centre of the antechamber at Fontainebleau, the vast, cold space that had witnessed the signing of treaties and the birth of laws, now a tomb for my dynasty. The scent of beeswax and old paper, once the smell of power, now seemed like the cloying perfume of embalming fluid. My marshals, the men I had raised from obscurity, the dukes and princes of my own creation, avoided my gaze. Nay, the bravest of the brave now stared at his boots as if they held the secrets of the universe. MacDonald, ever dutiful, looked grim but resolute. They had been the architects of my glory, but in the end they were merely masons. And when the keystone of my will was removed, the entire arch had collapsed. It was Marmont, my oldest friend, my brother-in-arms since Toulon, who had delivered the final treacherous blow, marching his corps over to the enemy. Betrayal, I had learned, was the final tax levied on greatness. The journey south was a descent into a personal hell I could not have conceived. My empire had not simply been taken, it was being erased, and the people I had given 2 decades of glory were the ones holding the erasers. Through Burgundy and the Lyonnais, there were still faint cries of Vive l'Empereur from old soldiers and stubborn peasants. But as we rode deeper into Provence, the air grew thick with a hatred that was almost biblical in its ferocity. They had strung up effigies of me, grotesque scarecrows in my uniform, and set them ablaze. The white cockades of the Bourbons bloomed on every lapel like a pox. Near Orgon, a mob surrounded my carriage, their faces contorted with a venom that shocked me. These were not soldiers on a battlefield, but my own people. Abbas le tyran, they screamed, their voices a singular ugly beast. A mort l'ogre. The ogre, the name they gave me to frighten their children. I, who had given their sons purpose and their nation pride, was now a monster from a fairy tale. For the first time since my youth in Corsica, I felt a tremor of physical fear. I was forced to don the disguise of an Austrian officer's uniform for my own. Safety, a humiliation that burned deeper than any wound I had ever suffered. To be a stranger, a hated enemy, in my own France. The irony was a blade twisting in my gut. And then Elba. From the deck of the British frigate Undaunted, it looked like a shard of rock dropped into the sea by a careless god. Portoferraio, its main town, was a jumble of faded ochre and pink houses clinging to a hillside, presided over by a pair of grim-looking fortresses. Captain Campbell, my British warden, stood beside me, a model of polite reserve. He likely thought he was witnessing the final taming of a beast. "A beautiful island, Your Majesty," he offered, his French precise and clipped. I scanned the rugged coastline, the scrubby macchia, the shimmering, indifferent sea. "It is a very small island, Captain," I replied. "A kingdom of 224 square kilometers for a man who had redrawn the map of Europe." The monarchs of the coalition had a fine sense of humor. They had not just caged the eagle, they had given it a perch so small it could not even spread its wings without touching the bars. My first days were a study in the absurd. I was given 2 residences, the Palazzina dei Mulini, a modest villa overlooking the sea, and a summer home in the hills. I had a personal guard of a few hundred of my old grognards, loyal to the last, who had followed me into this miniature exile. I designed a flag for my new kingdom, a white field with a diagonal red stripe, adorned with 3 golden bees. The bees, an ancient symbol of French sovereignty, were my quiet act of defiance against the Bourbon fleur-de-lis. But a man like me cannot simply preside over symbols. My mind, which had once juggled the logistics of a continental army and the codification of an entire legal system, now had only Elba. And so I threw myself at Elba. I became its most industrious citizen. I woke before dawn, riding out to inspect the iron mines that were the island's chief resource. I found them inefficient, mismanaged. I gave orders, drew up new plans for excavation, redesigned the transport routes. I organized the construction of new roads and a modern hospital. I reformed the island's administration and its hopelessly tangled system of local taxes. I worked tirelessly, relentlessly, from dawn until long after the sun had plunged into the Tyrrhenian Sea. My energy baffled the Elbans and worried Campbell. He would watch me, a bemused expression on his face, as I dictated letters, sketched maps, and interrogated local fishermen about the currents and prevailing winds. He thought it was the nervous energy of a caged animal. He was not entirely wrong, but it was more than that. It was the only way to keep the silence at bay. For in the quiet of the night, when the work was done and the murmur of my small court had faded, the silence would return, and with it the ghost of a small boy in a formal suit. I would stand on my terrace, the salty air cool on my face, and look out at the sea. To the west, on a clear night, I could almost imagine the distant lights of Corsica, my birthplace. To the east, the coast of Italy, the first land I had conquered in the name of France. I was surrounded by my own history, yet completely cut off from it. In those moments, the crushing weight I had felt at Fontainebleau would return. Every road I built on Elba felt like a mockery of the grand Roman roads I had laid across my empire. Every ton of iron ore I extracted was a pathetic echo of the vast industrial machine I had set in motion. It was all a parody of power, a game to distract a child. And always, the thought of Francois, my son, the King of Rome. Now, they called him the Duke of Reichstadt. They were teaching him German, surrounding him with the Habsburg eagles, slowly, methodically poisoning his memory of me. Would he remember my face, my voice? Or would he grow up to see me as the history books of his captors would paint me, the ogre, the tyrant, the Corsican usurper? The grief would rise, hot and acidic, in my throat. But then something else would follow. A cold, hard clarity. This was not an ending. This was a crucible. The marshals had forsaken me, my wife had abandoned me for the arms of an Austrian count, the kings of Europe had cast me out. They believed they had won. They thought the story was over, but they had left me with two things, my mind and a burning, singular purpose. They had taken my son, and in doing so had given me a reason far greater than any empire. Glory as a fickle mistress, and power a fleeting shadow. But the love of a father for his son, that is a force of nature. I looked out at the dark water, the same waves that lapped against the shores of France. An emperor learns patience. He learns to watch the tides. He learns that a tactical retreat is not a defeat, but a prelude to a new attack. The chain had not strangled me. It had been stretched, taut, and a chain under tension stores a tremendous amount of energy. I would have my son back. He would have his throne. My story was not over. It had merely paused for breath. The breath I took was the salt-laced air of the Gulf of Juan. It was a cold, sharp inhalation of freedom, the first true lungful I had taken in 10 months. On Elba, even the air had felt rationed, thin and stale with the scent of my enemy's condescension. Here, on the soil of France, it smelled of pine, of wet earth, and of possibility. My 1,000 men, my old guard of this new, desperate venture, were a motley collection of loyalists, adventurers, and dreamers. But as they disembarked, their eyes reflected the same fire that burned in my gut. They saw not a deposed monarch, but the emperor. They saw France itself, embodied in my grey coat and worn Bicorne hat. The road to Paris was a gamble only a man with nothing left to lose would undertake. The local garrisons were sworn to the Bourbon King Louis. To them, I was a traitor, an outlaw. The first real test came near Grenoble. The 5th Regiment of the line blocked the pass, their muskets levelled, their young faces a mixture of fear and duty. My generals urged caution, a detour. I waved them aside. A detour is a confession of weakness. I dismounted and walked forward alone. The silence of the Alpine valley broken only by the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I could feel the crosshairs of 100 gazes on my chest. I stopped, well within musket range, and threw open my greatcoat, exposing the simple uniform beneath. Soldiers of the 5th. My voice, accustomed to commanding armies across continents, echoed in the narrow pass. If there is a soldier among you who would kill his emperor, here I am. For a beat, the world held its breath. A young officer raised his sword, his mouth opening to shout an order. But the cry that came from the ranks was not fire. It was a single, guttural roar. Vive l'Empereur! It was a dam breaking. They threw down their muskets, tore the white Bourbon cockades from their shakos, and surged forward, not as attackers, but as supplicants, as sons returning to their father. Many were weeping. I allowed myself a grim, internal smile. This was a power no king could buy. This was loyalty forged in the snows of Russia and the sands of Egypt. The march to Paris became a triumphal procession. The eagle, as the saying went, flew from steeple to steeple until it landed on the towers of Notre Dame. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, who had promised Louis he would bring me back to Paris in an iron cage, met me with his army and promptly knelt to kiss my hand, his own tears tracing paths through the dust on his cheeks. I embraced him. In this great game, one cannot afford to hold grudges, only to remember who is useful. Paris was a frenzy. The city welcomed me as a savior from the bumbling vengery monarchy of the Bourbons. But I had no time for celebration. The Tuileries Palace felt cold, empty. Marie-Louise and my son were prisoners in Vienna, pawns of her father, the Austrian emperor. Every gilded chair, every silken drapery was a reminder of what had been stolen from me. The cold, hard clarity returned. The cheering crowds were a means to an end. The throne was a tool. The true objective was my boy, my heir, the future of my dynasty. The kings of Europe, of course, did not share my paternal sentiments. They declared me an outlaw, a monster uncaged, and their armies began to crawl across the map like a plague of locusts. My mind, the one weapon they could not strip from me, worked ceaselessly. I was outnumbered, outsupplied, and friendless on the continent. A lesser man would have sued for peace. But an emperor knows that the only peace you are granted is the one you carve out with the sword. My plan was audacity itself. Strike north, into Belgium. The English under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher were closest, but they were separated. I would be the wedge that drove between them, defeating each in turn before the Austrians and Russians could arrive. It was the strategy of my youth in Italy, updated for a final, desperate roll of the dice. The Army of the North was a shadow of my Grande Armée. It was filled with veterans, yes, but also with beardless boys who only knew my name from stories. Yet when I reviewed them, I saw the old fire in their eyes. They believed in me, and so, for a time, I believed in us. On June 16th, at Ligny, it worked. The dice rolled in my favor. I fell upon Blücher's Prussians with calculated fury, shattering his center. It was a bloody, brutal affair, but it was a victory. The old magic was still there. I sent Marshal Grouchy with a third of my army to pursue the retreating Prussians, to ensure they could not recover and link up with Wellington. It was a sound order. It was the correct tactical decision. It was the hinge upon which my world would break. 2 days later, the sky wept over the fields of Mont Saint-Jean. The rain had turned the valley into a sodden quagmire, delaying my attack. The mud clung to cannon wheels, to boots, to spirits. It was a bad omen. Wellington had chosen his ground well, a defensive ridge with strong points. At the chateau of Hougomont and the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, he was a stubborn, unimaginative commander, but he knew how to defend a hill. The battle began with the thunder of my grand battery, the earth shaking as if the gods themselves were at war. For hours, it was a maelstrom of smoke, iron, and blood. My infantry threw themselves against the English lines. Ney, magnificent and foolish in his courage, led charge after charge with the cavalry, mistaking a tactical withdrawal for a rout. He broke them against the unflinching British squares, wasting my finest horsemen on an unbreakable wall of bayonets. From my vantage point, I watched with a growing sense of dread. It was glorious, but it was not war. It was suicide. He is compromising us, I muttered, the frustration of physical pain in my chest. Still, we pressed. We took La Haye-Sainte. The British centre was wavering. The moment was at hand. Victory was a tangible thing, a ripe fruit, waiting to be plucked. I had one last card to play, the Imperial Guard, my immortals. The men who had never known defeat while I led them. But as I prepared to unleash them, a shadow appeared on the eastern horizon. Not the dust cloud of Grouchy's returning corps, but the dark blue uniforms of the Prussians. Blucher, the old devil, beaten and bruised, had slipped Grouchy's grasp and force-marched his men to Wellington's aid. The crucible was now a forge, and I was being hammered on the anvil of fate. There was no choice. I sent the guard forward, not for a decisive victory, but to stave off a catastrophic defeat. They marched into the Valley of Death, a river of bearskin and bayonets, their cry of Vive l'Empereur cutting through the cannon smoke. I watched through my spyglass, my heart a cold stone in my chest. I saw them falter. I saw them stop. And then, for the first time in their storied history, I saw them break and run. The sight broke something in me. The chain, stretched taut for so long, had snapped. The stored energy did not unleash a triumphant victory, but a chaotic, shattering implosion. The army dissolved around me. The retreat became a rout. I was swept along by the tide of terrified men, a powerless emperor in a sea of his own broken dreams. The cold, hard clarity I had found on Elba was gone, replaced by the ringing in my ears and the bitter taste of ash in my mouth. My story had not paused for breath. It had screamed itself hoarse, and was now choking on its own blood. The waves that lapped against the shores of France had carried me home on a tide of hope, and now they were casting me out on an ebb of utter despair. I had not reclaimed my son. I had only succeeded in making him the orphan of a twice-defeated exile. And that was not a crucible. That was an ending. The night that followed was not a respite, but an extension of the chaos, painted in darker hues. The retreat from Waterloo was a torrent of human misery, and I, its supposed source, was but a piece of driftwood in the current. My marshals, those who remained, formed a desperate sort of honor guard. Around me, their faces grim masks of exhaustion and disbelief. We rode through the darkness, the sounds of pursuit a constant phantom threat at our backs. The army had ceased to be an army. It was a hemorrhage, bleeding out across the Belgian countryside, staining the roads to France with its lifeblood. Each hoofbeat of my horse was a hammer blow against the anvil of my skull. Where was the clear-headed strategist of Austerlitz? The indomitable will of the pyramids? Gone. In his place was a man hollowed out by the spectacle of his own myth-shattering. I saw the faces of my grognards, my old guard, not as they marched into the fire, but as they streamed past me in the rout, their eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in them before. It was the terror of children who had just discovered their father was mortal. We reached Paris on the morning of the 21st. The city was a fever dream, rife with rumor and fear. There were no cheering crowds now. The faces that watched my carriage rattle towards the Élysée Palace were pinched with anxiety, their silence a far more damning indictment than any jeer. The capital could smell death on me, the death of an empire. Inside the palace, the gilded halls felt like a mausoleum. My ministers shuffled and avoided my gaze. My brother, Lucien, ever the revolutionary idealist, urged me to dissolve the chambers, declare a state of siege, and rule as a dictator to save France. For a fleeting moment, the old fire stirred. I could do it. I could raise Paris, rally the federations, fight street by street. But the image of the guard breaking returned to me, an unholy ghost at the feast of my ambition. The army was gone. The magic of my name, the aura of invincibility that had been my greatest weapon, had been blown to smoke and vapor on the plains of Mont Saint-Jean. To fight on now would not be to save France, but to tear her apart in my own death throes. The true battle was no longer against Wellington or Blucher, but against the politicians in the chambers. Men I had elevated, men who owed me everything, now circled like vultures. At their head was Fouché, the Duke of Otranto, that silken serpent, his political poison more potent than any Prussian cannonball. He had always served two masters, Napoleon Bonaparte and the inevitable successor to Napoleon Bonaparte. I knew he was already negotiating with the Bourbons, ensuring his own survival in the new regime. He moved through the corridors of power, whispering of abdication, of stability, of peace, my end. For 2 days, I wrestled with the hydra of political reality. I made speeches. I consulted with my loyalists. I walked the gardens of the Élysée, the scent of roses a cruel reminder of a beauty and peace I could no longer possess. But with every passing hour, the ground beneath my feet crumbled further. The chambers declared themselves in permanent session, a direct challenge to my authority. Lafayette, a relic of a revolution I had tamed, called for my abdication in the name of liberty. The irony was suffocating. They spoke of saving France from my tyranny, when I alone had saved it from the chaos they now sought to embrace. Finally, on the 22nd of June, I faced the inevitable. I sat at my desk, a single sheet of paper before me. The words came slowly, each one a stone laid upon my own tomb. I offer myself as a sacrifice to the hatred of the enemies of France. May they be sincere in their declarations, and have really directed them only against my person. My hand did not shake. It was the calm of the condemned man who has made his peace with the executioner. I finished with a flourish, naming my son, the little King of Rome, as my successor, Napoleon II, Emperor of the French. It was my last move on the grand chessboard, a final, desperate attempt to preserve the dynasty. But I knew it was a hollow gesture. A ghost king, held captive in Vienna by his grandfather, the Austrian emperor. My son would never rule. Fouché and the traitors would see to that. They would hand France back to the fat, gouty Louis XVIII, and my son, my Aiglon, my little eagle, would remain a gilded prisoner, a footnote in his father's epic. I retreated to Malmaison, Josephine's old home. The place was thick with her memory, her ghost lingering in the scent of the roses she had loved so dearly. Here, the weight of empire fell away, replaced by the more intimate, sharper pain of personal loss. I walked the paths where we had strolled, remembering her laughter, her grace, the woman who had been my empress when the star of my destiny burned its brightest. It was here, surrounded by the ghosts of a happier past, that I finally understood. The Elbe I had constructed in my mind, that period of reflection and rebirth, had been a lie. I had not been reforged. I had merely been gathering my strength for one last glorious act of self-destruction. The provisional government grew impatient. I was a dangerous icon, and they wanted me gone. They sent their agents, hounding me towards the coast. My destination was Rochefort, where 2 frigates supposedly awaited to carry me to America. America, a new world. The thought was tempting. To live as a gentleman farmer, a scientist, to escape the tangled, bloody history of Europe. To be Cincinnatus, returning to his plough. But I am not Cincinnatus. I am Napoleon. My stage is the world, not some rustic farm in Virginia. As I stood on the coast at Rochefort, watching the sails of the British blockade, squadron on the horizon, a different, more audacious plan formed. The Americans were provincials. The French were fickle. But the English were my great adversary. They had fought me for 2 decades. They, more than anyone, understood the scale of my life, the magnitude of my fall. To flee to America was to escape. To surrender to the English was to make a statement. It was a final, grand gesture befitting my legend. I would throw myself upon the mercy of my most steadfast enemy. I drafted a letter to their Prince Regent, styling myself a modern Themistocles seeking refuge by the hearth of the British people. It was pure theatre, and I was its lead actor. On July 15th, I boarded the British man-of-war, HMS Bellerophon. As the crew rowed me from the French brig, I did not look back. I stood tall, my hand tucked into my waistcoat, the familiar pose that 1,000 artists had captured. The British sailors stared, their faces a mixture of awe and curiosity. I was no longer an emperor, but I was not yet a prisoner. I was a living myth, a creature of legend stepping from the pages of history onto the deck of their ship. As the Bellerophon weighed anchor and the shores of France, my France dissolved. Into the summer haze for the last time, a cold peace settled over me. The crucible of Waterloo had not forged a new crown. It had melted the old one, and the molten metal had cooled into the chains I now wore. The tide had not just cast me out, it had carried me to a final lonely rock in the middle of the ocean. My story was over. All that remained was for my enemies to write the epilogue.